On October 14, 1943, about 291 B-17 flying fortresses crossed into Germany to destroy one industry. 60 never came back, 17 more limped home and were written off as scrap. Roughly 600 airmen were killed, wounded or captured, close to a fifth of the force that had lifted off that morning. The crews called it Black Thursday. A 20% loss rate is not a bad morning. It is a number that ends campaigns, because no air force replaces a fifth of its bombers week after week. The target was ball bearings. The premise of strategic bombing said the entire German war machine turned on that single bottleneck. No bearings, no tanks, no aircraft, no trucks. German bearing production stopped for about 6 weeks. 83 years later, the same premise is being tested again, against warehouses instead of factories, 600 miles behind the front, with machines that cost less than a well-equipped pickup truck and are never expected to come home. Whether cheap changes, the answer is the whole question. Because Schweinfurt failed for a reason that had nothing to do with the crews. Germany had stockpiles, it had surplus capacity, and once the raids showed how concentrated the industry was, the plants were broken apart and scattered. The bottleneck stopped being a bottleneck. 600 men and 77 bombers bought 6 weeks of delay and one permanent lesson. An economy under attack does not stand still. It disperses. That lesson is the strongest argument against everything that has happened inside Russia since the middle of July. What Schweinfurt actually proved was narrower than the theory that launched it. The bottleneck was real. Reaching it was possible. But the price of reaching it, paid in crews and airframes, was higher than the delay it bought. And the delay itself expired the moment the target reorganized. Change that price, and the argument changes with it. The machine doing the work is the Liutyi, designated An-196, built by Ukroboronprom. It is a one-way attack drone. It flies out, it finds its target, and it is consumed. Its official specification lists a range of about 620 miles, carrying a warhead of roughly 165 pounds. Claims that it has reached more than 1,000 miles rest on the resemblance of video footage rather than recovered wreckage and should be treated as unconfirmed. Cost is where it gets uncomfortable for the defender. The figure usually attached to the Liutyi is about $200,000 per unit, though that number traces back to a single 2024 estimate and has never been officially verified. The cheaper machine matters more. The FP1 runs roughly $55,000. And Ukrainian industry monitors put production near 100 a day. Around 60% of deep strikes are attributed to FP1 type platforms. 100 a day. That is not a raid. That is a production line pointed at a rear area. The 1943 raid was an event, assembled, launched, absorbed, counted. This is a weather pattern. The defender does not get to recover between them, and nobody is going to a funeral for a lost airframe. And a fulfillment hub is close to a perfect target for it. Enormous, packed with things that burn, and at more than 600 miles from the front, sitting outside any air defense belt built to protect an army. The Wildberries hub at Alexandrovka, outside Voronezh, covers roughly 1.6 million square feet, about 90 million items under one roof, according to the Kiev Post. When it was hit, fire spread across some 390,000 square feet of it. A separate warehouse fire in Krasnodar took more than 100 firefighters and a helicopter to bring under control, the Moscow Times reported. Air defense is finite, and it is allocated. Interceptors sit over the front, over the capital, over air bases and refineries and command nodes. A distribution center full of winter coats and phone chargers is nowhere on that list, and it cannot be moved. No armor, no hardened shelters, steel, cardboard, and shrink wrap. Wildberries is not a company most Americans have heard of, and that is exactly why the scale is easy to miss. It is the largest marketplace in Russia. Its sales volume is equivalent to roughly 3% of Russian GDP, per Bloomberg reporting, and about 10% of all Russian retail. Open source trackers count around 200 logistics facilities across the country. CNBC puts the workforce near 48,000. The rough American equivalent would be a single retailer, moving $1 in 10 of everything sold in the country out of 200 buildings, with no competitor able to absorb the volume if those buildings stopped. Online retail, as a whole, now runs at about 5% of Russian GDP, a sector that, by Novaya Gazeta Europe's accounting, rivals agriculture, oil refining, and metallurgy. Its founder and chief executive, Tatiana Kim, is the richest woman in Russia and already under international sanctions, which raises the question of what those warehouses actually hold. Listed on the platform, the Moscow Times found body armor, combat helmets, camouflage clothing, and fiber optic cable of the kind used to control drones that cannot be jammed. Dual-use goods, sold to civilians, useful to soldiers. The fiber optic spool is the item that matters most in that list, because a drone flown down a physical wire is immune to every jammer the other side owns. Dual use is also where the honest version of this story stops. Kyiv goes further. President Zelensky has said the warehouses held sanctioned components for drone production and navigation. That is an interested party describing its own target, and there is no publicly confirmed evidence that the company cooperates with the Russian Ministry of Defense. The strongest link runs the other direction. Yuri Fedorenko, commander of Ukraine's 429th Unmanned Systems Brigade, says Russian units began rationing drone components after the strikes destroyed stockpiles. Again, a Ukrainian source describing a Ukrainian success. Sales of military equipment on the platform are reported to have fallen sharply since. Then, there is the arithmetic. 2 warehouses, roughly 30 billion rubles in physical damage, about $381 million per Bloomberg. The drones that did it cost somewhere between tens of thousands and $200,000 each, and even the high figure is disputed. Sellers whose goods were inside are facing losses approaching $3.5 billion by Forbes Russia's estimate. Set those figures beside each other, and the exchange rate is plain. A machine worth less than a delivery truck traded against a building worth hundreds of millions and the inventory of thousands of businesses inside it. No army has ever bought that ratio at the front. And this was not a single demonstration. It started on July 18, 2026. That first weekend, warehouses burned at Elektrostal outside Moscow and in the Tambov region. 8 people were killed and more than 70 injured. It was not improvised. Kyiv had approved a 40-day operation on June 25th and calls the campaign long-range sanctions. Then it kept going, and the pattern hardened. On July 22nd, 2 more hubs, in the Krasnodar and Stavropol regions. At least 1 dead, and the Krasnodar governor reported 10 injured. July 24th, a warehouse near St. Petersburg. July 29th, the Ryazan hub in flames, and a strike in the Novoselki area outside Moscow that killed 5. August 4th, Voronezh, 1 dead. August 11th, a warehouse in the Vladimir region. 3 weeks, 6 regions, and no indication the list was finished. The running totals depend on who is counting and when. By August 2nd, open-source trackers had 16 of the 26 largest hubs, about 60%, out of action. By August 4th, the Russian outlet Vyostka counted 14 warehouses and some 16 million square feet shut down. By August 5th, Deutsche Welle put the number of sites struck at 21. By the end of July, at least 9 people had been killed and dozens injured. Several were migrant workers from Central Asia, hired to move boxes in a building nobody had thought of as a front line. Whatever the warehouses were supplying, the people inside them were sorting parcels on a night shift. Forbes Russia estimates that between 14 and 22% of the company's warehouse space was damaged in July alone. Marketplace revenue fell 6% in a single week, according to Ukrainian reporting, a figure worth holding loosely. Russian analysts quoted by the Moscow Times put the physical damage from one weekend at up to 100 billion rubles, around $1.3 billion. Robert Brovdy, who commands Ukraine's drone forces, described the strikes as a psychological operation aimed at destroying the illusion of a comfortable peacetime. The response inside Russia has been careful. Tatiana Kim confirmed the impacts and the evacuation of workers. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the situation difficult and said officials were in contact with the company. Reuters reports the government may step in through the state bank VTB. So, an old idea, a cheap weapon, and a target that is commercial rather than military. Al Jazeera's framing is that the campaign is not about the front line at all. Ukrainian analysis argues a double purpose, cutting one supply channel while putting systemic pressure on the wider economy. The people who study the Russian economy are less impressed. The economist Dmitry Nekrasov argues the strikes mean serious trouble for sellers and bad optics for the Kremlin, but are unlikely to paralyze the broader economy. A market analyst cited by Novaya Gazeta Europe notes that Russia has more than 650 million square feet of quality warehouse space, and the 2 big marketplaces hold roughly a sixth of it. Alexei Kushch expects adaptation rather than failure. Decentralized logistics, higher costs, large hubs broken into smaller ones. Riddle Russia judges the company too big to let fail and reports it is already scouting warehouse space in Kazakhstan. Decentralize, disperse, absorb the cost. That is Schweinfurt's answer, given again 83 years later. Which is why the caution in those assessments is worth more than the enthusiasm around them. It is not analysts hedging for the sake of hedging. It is the one part of this story that already has a documented precedent. The vulnerability, though, is not uniquely Russian. More than 85% of American forces and equipment deploy from the continental United States, and they move on commercial infrastructure, commercial ports, commercial trucking, commercial warehouses. The Army's own writing in 2026 calls it the end of strategic sanctuary. Geography no longer shields the homeland from an asymmetric attack on logistics. U.S. Transportation Command, U.S. Transcom, has a name for the commercial airlift and sea lift it depends on, the fourth component. As the industry association puts it, their risk is USTRANSCOM's risk. Those ships and aircraft are not protected assets. They are businesses, operating on commercial schedules out of commercial facilities, and the entire ability of the United States to put an army somewhere depends on them running. A RAND study in 2020 concluded that the Army's methods for assessing threats to the homeland were inadequate for the modern one. And in 2024, the closure of the Port of Baltimore, not an attack, an accident, immobilized fast sea-lift ships that exist for one purpose: moving an army overseas in a hurry. The method is proven. Not collapse, not defeat, pressure, and a real bottleneck, imposed 600 miles behind the line for a fraction of what Schweinfurt cost in men and machines. Whether it changes the war is a separate question, and the honest answer is that nobody knows yet. What is settled is that the method exists, and that it is cheap enough to repeat, and warehouses were only half the argument. The rail lines and the roads of southern Russia were the other half, and that half started first.